we'll let you continue.
Good morning, everyone, and good morning for the attendance of the session in the Americas. Good afternoon for the attendance of the session in Europe and Africa. And good evening for the attendance of the session in Asia. My name is Joel Brownen, and I'm the country manager of Solidaridad in Colombia, based in Bogota. Today, I will be the moderator of this session, in which we will discuss how ICT solutions can support the implementation of due diligence legislation in the last mile of agro supply chains. I would like to introduce first the panelists of our session today. And our first speaker will be Felipe Carrasco from Costa Rica. Felipe Carrasco is currently the head of public sector engagement at the Tropical Forest Alliance, which is an initiative housed by the World Economic Forum. He brings more than 20 years of experience developing and overseeing programs and initiatives addressing policy, governance, financial instruments, among others. And his work has included overseeing a vast portfolio of programs and projects across the globe. Our second speaker will be Martina Spinach from the US. Martina is the Vice President of Research and Development of the Beauty Care and Consumer Division of Henkel in North America. She brings over 30 years of experience in research and development in the beauty and laundry and home care R&D for the company Henkel, and is a passionate person about delivering new products and benefits to consumers. Our third panelist is Niels Wieler from the Netherlands. Niels is the CEO and founder of Diligence. He's an expert on satellite-based forest agriculture, carbon and water monitoring solutions with his team at Diligence. He helps different supply chain stakeholders turn commodity risk into an opportunity. And Niels has a study background in forestry and geoinformation science. Our fourth panelist is Jose Pardo from Colombia. Jose is the Director of Strategic Alliances for the Grupo Oleoflores, one of the main palm oil producers in Colombia. Oleoflores works with more than 36 associations that congregate more than 1,600 farmers recognized as strategic partners. And our last speaker is Rosemary Adeko from Ghana. Rosemary is the program manager for NISCOPS, a program that is being implemented in Ghana. And she's been working with Solidaridad since 2010. She's a very passionate person about smallholders and the use of ICT. So let's start with a short overview of the proposed mandatory legislation initiatives in Germany and the EU for corporate due diligence in global supply chains. Felipe, you're working for Tropical Forest Alliance, and you're very active in ensuring that the legislation is applicable across agro supply chains. Can you provide us a first overview of what we're talking about?
Hello, Joel, and hello to everyone. Pleasure to be here today. Yes, I'll provide a brief overview of the context around which these regulations are being discussed. Let's make a reference first that the German regulation has already been approved, was approved and came into it was even published within the German approval process last summer, and will come into effect in January 23rd. Well, it has a two-step approach in terms of coming into effect. First, in January 2023, companies that have a relatively big size, 3,000 plus employees, will have to abide under this regulation. And then on January 24th for smaller companies. The German exercise or the German experience, it's one of the many instruments that make this bigger compound of regulatory framework dynamics that the EU is trying, the European Union is trying to move forward to tackle deforestation, building from the communication that the European Union developed or generated in 2019. This communication is extremely important because although now the attention is focused on these regulatory framework discussions, as I mentioned, the German piece already approved and the EU regulatory framework under discussion, we should not lose sight of the importance of the cohesive approach, what we in TFA call the smart mix of measures, as to make sure that these regulations can really become a conduit for appropriate integration between producers and consumers. The communication tackles or frames 5 key points, right? Reducing the footprint of the EU consumption. This is basically to be achieved through regulatory frameworks. There's 4 other components that complement this element, which is partnership with producer countries, strengthening international cooperation and redirecting finance, and also supporting the availability and quality of information, which I highlighted in black because it's of importance for the topic of this session. So what I want you to understand is that although there's a lot of attention on the regulatory framework, this is one piece of many that need to be developed. And I think that to the extent possible, technology, it's seen as a conduit, as a mechanism to really accelerate the development and put in practice of all these components in a holistic manner, we might be able to achieve the intended purpose. Next slide, Nancy, please, if you can. And now, within the regulatory discussion, which is basically what captures our attention now, there's a lot of elements. I'm going to focus on the EU regulatory discussion. As I mentioned, part of the discussion builds from experiences such as the German supply chain regulation that came into practice. Important for you to be aware, the scope of the regulatory framework, how comprehensive this would be. It's tackling several commodities, but there's still a discussion on how far they should go, especially with added value products linked to these commodities. This represents an enormous challenge for producer countries, and it's important to have that in mind. Then secondly, there's a heavy component on due diligence. This is basically a regulation to make sure that the footprint of the EU, of this market, can really be diminished. Again, the communication has an integral proposal to go beyond that, because one thing is to avoid importing deforestation to the European Union. The other one, another thing is to make sure that the deforestation doesn't take place. The risk of leakages to other emerging markets is there. But we should understand how important it is to have good implementable due diligence in place. The proposal speaks about a cutoff date of December 31st, 2020, as a way of starting to measure the deforestation impact. And it's important to have in mind. Now, within the scope of the regulation, next slide, please, Nancy, there's many topics that are being discussed as we move forward. This represents an enormous challenge. I just want to flag, I already mentioned scope, right, with commodities, but also in terms of how far the regulatory approach can go into the financial sector, as to make sure that finance policies get considered or affected by the regulatory framework. The issue of other ecosystems, so that it's not only linked to deforestation of tropical forests, but also, mangroves and savannas and valuable ecosystems, so that we don't have leakages within different geographies. And then once you go into the regulation, you have more complex issues. There's a lot of debate on the criteria that needs to be used. For example, the definition of deforestation, the FAO definition gets cited, how applicable this is within other contexts, and how you make sure that you have a robust set of definitions, of parameters that can make sure this is an applicable regulatory framework. When you go into the more complex elements of risk management, you identify that there is a need of managing information to have an effective system in place. The regulation taps into a benchmarking system currently developed at a national level, which is quite broad, but with an opportunity to try to focus more on jurisdictional levels. That will depend on how much information and capacity exists to put together a risk management scheme that is applicable at that level. I'm highlighting this because I think the use of information, of digital technologies, can become a real instrument to showcase that we could go deeper into the risk assessment approach. Next to the benchmarking, there's an important element. There's a package of issues related to due diligence processes, due diligence statements and obligations for corporations, but let me focus on one that I think is extremely important and linked to this benchmarking system, which is the geolocalization component. Basically, there's going to be an enormous push for traceability through the through the regulatory framework, and this poses many challenges. Primarily, the issue of assuring that you can go all the way to the ground. The purpose of this event, how do we are able to cover that last mile, but how do you do that in a way that you don't alienate smallholders? What's the appropriate package of tools that you can apply so that this can be a comprehensive and inclusive regulatory framework, and not one that creates a divide across stakeholders that manage commodities. I would conclude saying that there's an enormous push to make sure that this regulatory framework goes hand in hand to the second component of the communication, which is producer partnerships, so that you can have the appropriate schemes and instruments to really foster incentives within the engagement of stakeholders that are leading the way, that are being proactive at the producer level. We don't want the regulatory framework, or it's not intended within the approach for the regulatory framework to create a trade barrier. It's the other way around. How can we create an ambitious but yet feasible framework that allows us to mainstream deforestation, human rights, deforestation-free human rights issues within the scope of the regulation? I'll leave it there. This provides an interesting framework for the discussion of our experts, and happy to jump into details in our panel discussion. Over to you, Jared.
Thank you so much, Felipe, for this very useful and resourceful overview of this due diligence legislation that is coming up. And as you mentioned, I think there's a few things that are interesting to pick up, and in terms of the inclusivity of that legislation, and also the implementation, specifically in the last mile. And as this is already something that is under development, there are also companies already, let's say, working in this space and have very good experience already in that area. So I would like to turn to Martina. And Martina, you have been working at Henkel specifically on the use of ICT in the last mile, and then also not only from a due diligence perspective, also creating impact results for the company, but basically for everyone in the supply chain. Can you give us a bit more background on how the company deals with it?
Absolutely. So hello, everyone. I'm Martina Spanach. I'm Vice President of Research and Development for Henkel Consumer Goods for the beauty care products in North America. Henkel Beauty Care North America makes brands like Dial Soap, Schwarzkopf Hair Color, and Got2b Hair Styling and Color. So I'd like to take maybe a little step back and talk about our overall POM strategy. So again, I appreciate the invitation from you, Joel, to participate in this panel, to share our strategy and to talk about how we're taking this kind of all the way to the end, to providing tools that would then be able to provide traceability. So, at Henkel, we've been focused on ensuring sustainability in our palm oil supply for many years. Our goal is to make sure that the ingredients in our products are made from either sustainable palm or palm kernel oil. And with this in mind, we're working with the companies from which we source our raw materials and other partners to try to influence the palm oil supply chain all the way from smallholders through the overall supply chain to consumers. We want to make sure that our supply chains ensure what we call full NDPE, no deforestation, no peat, no exploitation, and to make sure that the palm or palm kernel oils that go into our products are not associated with any deforestation of primary or secondary rainforests. So our strategy for 2025 has three components: compliance and certification, transparency and traceability, and social impact and conservation. We're focused on transforming our palm oil supply chain by working with our suppliers, also our peer companies, and also through partnerships. And one of these partnerships is with Solidaridad, and it started in 2012, and it continues today. So let me walk through this a little bit. Now, as a first point, we're ensuring that 100% of our palm oil is responsibly sourced. This is externally assured with mass balance certification, and we consider this a top-down approach. So we want to take this to the higher level, but still using a top-down approach. We're working to ensure that we have traceability in the palm oil supply. We collaborate currently with ASD, with peer companies, and our suppliers to understand the traceability of our supply chain. And based on this evaluation, we have traceability of over 80% of our supply back to the mill. And we're proud of this. We feel like it's quite high in the industry. So then let's think, so as we go forward, we're going to augment these top-down approaches by strengthening bottoms-up or grassroots approaches. And with these grassroots approaches, we're focused directly on the smallholders, improving their livelihood while also ensuring nature conservation. And in order to support the farmers' livelihoods, we've been partnering with Solidaridad on various projects over the last 10 years. We've sponsored projects across a variety of different countries: Colombia, Ghana, Honduras, Indonesia, Mexico, Nicaragua, and Nigeria over this past 10 years. And through these projects, we're hoping to contribute to the increased availability of sustainable palm oil, but also enabling smallholders to certify their crops, to increase their productivity, and to improve their livelihoods in order to drive the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. We just started a new project, a new partnership with Solidaridad in Colombia, which we're very excited about, and it's focused on providing tools and education to farmers in Colombia, the smallholders in Colombia, which can then be used to provide traceability of sustainable palm from those smallholders all the way through the supply chain in Colombia. So we're starting from the beginning with Solidaridad. We're starting from the beginning of the supply chain, which is the smallholders, helping to educate them on sustainable farming tools and providing them tools which can then create traceability in that supply chain. And the program includes auditing so that we know at the farm level what is happening. Through that program, they can be certified for SPO. The project will provide traceability from these smallholder farms all the way to the refining plant for the oils, and then to the bar soap production, which produces bar soap, which is called Dial Bar Soap. So through this, we're creating traceability from farm to bar. We call this the Farm to Bar project. And this is a very unique project which can show the feasibility of the use of ICT tools in this sort of limited ecosystem, within Colombia, from smallholder to oil processing through bar soap production. And we're looking forward to seeing how the enhancements of this project and using it to learn about the potential to scale this future. So we consider this a lighthouse project. We hope to learn from it and replicate it in other regions, again, and with other commodities. So at Henkel, we believe that projects like this are going to contribute to the overall sustainability purpose for our company, which is to create transformational impact for the good of generations. So thank you very much. I'll pass it on now.
Thank you so much, Martina. And that was a very rich and very helpful overview of what you do as a company. I feel it's very pioneering what you do at the moment. And I think that's also providing a lot of learnings as well for later scaling as well, as this will become much broader as well in the future. So we will really looking forward to hear more also from your companies in the near future, what the results and impact that has coming up. So thank you for that. So one of the key topics under this proposed legislation for corporate due diligence is deforestation. Niels, you have been a pioneer in the use of satellite data for monitoring producers, specifically in the last mile of supply chains. Can you give us an example on how you do that? How to use these data for, let's say, for specifically in terms of action, interventions or improvements?
Absolutely. Thanks for having us. So a little bit about us as Diligence. We help you make better sourcing and investment decisions, and we do that using satellite data, machine learning, and supply chain data, using the satellites to tackle risk such as deforestation, indeed. Not only for palm, but for many other commodities as well, such as cocoa, etc. And we work with a lot of growers and traders, and I think in this discussion that is very important, more on that later, around the world, basically. But I'll show some examples from Indonesia, actually, and also the partnerships with for example, Solidaridad, Google and others. Rise is very important. Also from the scientific part from Wageningen University, for example. So if we talk about the EU due diligence procedural requirements as just published, then there's two things that are very important if we talk about ICT. First one, geo-coordinates. So the geolocation of all the production areas, the farms, the concessions. Secondly, the risk assessment, which EU says use satellite imagery and positioning for checking of compliance. So as I show, we are already working with a lot of corporates and other organizations. And when you talk about geolocation, I think many people are worried, saying, "Oh, all those smallholders, it's a super huge task. We can never do that." But I'm very hopeful because if you look, for example, at cocoa in West Africa, already a lot of GPS work is being done by local government agencies, by fast-moving consumer good brands, and by other stakeholders using GPS on the ground to walk the boundaries of the farm, actually having a huge number, more than 500,000 farms is what we are working with our clients and partners. So just to show that it is an ambitious task, but it can be done, and a lot is already done. And also mapping smallholders together with Solidaridad and others in palm and with the growers. It can be done. It is done. And the second part is, what can we do with the satellite monitoring? Well, we have now coverage over many areas around the world, very frequent information, very affordable information to check where is the forest, where is it disappearing. So that helps. It's available. And another thing which is very important is to put it all in context. We need to know the traceability, who is providing to whom, who is sourcing from whom. And also there is where ICT can help. So that's three parts. One critical thing is that if we talk about forests, we have to be very clear what forest is and why, because often areas can be cleared which are old plantations. So we have to be very careful that farmers, smallholders, are not blamed for just clearing their old growth areas for replanting and then being blamed for deforestation. So it's not that straightforward to monitor deforestation. It's very important that experts are looking at it in order to prevent issues here. So yeah, showing an example here from Indonesia, where there's the big plantations and there's the smallholder plantations mapped using GPS, which we overlay then with what is intact forest, which is the very dark green, and the regrowth, which is say, rubber plantations, etc. And then this data analysis shows that actually all the smallholders here, they're not clearing the forest, they're clearing the rubber for palm, etc. And having these drivers right, that will be crucial if we talk about the due diligence follow-up. And that's enabled by ICT. So that's why I brought it up. And then we can also track all kinds of trends for the whole sector, for each company, for each supplier, and where we're seeing with our data in Indonesia that actually the share of deforestation in the last years has already gone up associated with palm oil, while mining and other commodities are going up, basically. So that is kind of what we can do with the current type of ICT for agriculture. So I'll leave it by that.
Thank you, Niels, and I think that also, you bring to the table a lot of, I think, useful insights, particularly if you go with, driving ICT as a solution for the legislation and giving back, let's say, I think also data on what are the trends and how that evolves. And I will say what you already mentioned, not necessarily to put the blame necessarily on the smallholders, but rather understand them better and also they are better to craft your intervention in order to drive further down, let's say, these deforestation rates, for example, what you mentioned here in the case of Indonesia. Let us move from Indonesia to Ghana. And in Ghana, we have Rosemary Adeko. Rosemary is working for Solidaridad and particularly working in a program as well, using ICT for smallholders. And in Ghana, that is something that is particularly interesting as well because of the size of these farms, but also there what we want to go for is to understand a bit better on what are the barriers there for these farmers. So Rosemary, you're working on the ground with palm oil producers in Ghana to adopt practices that are aligned with corporate due diligence. The corporate due diligence criteria. So what difference do you see that ICT solutions make to help in that process?
Yeah, thank you, Joel. My name is Rosemary Adeko. I work for Solidaridad West Africa. I've been working for Solidaridad for the last 12 years, and I manage one of the oil palm programs. Oil palm and cocoa are major drivers of deforestation in Ghana. And so in Ghana, cocoa and oil palm corporates are interested to know the source of raw materials. They want deforestation-free cocoa beans and fresh fruit bunches. So what we have done in Solidaridad is to use GIS technology to establish traceability systems for smallholder farmers in cocoa and oil palm. So farms of every smallholder beneficiary of our cocoa and oil palm programs can be located on Google Map. We just want to make sure that our beneficiaries are not using the forest to produce a cocoa or the oil palm. And acreage of each farm is also known both to the producer and the buyer for decision making. So as you can see, this slide shows farms of cocoa farms, on Ghana map. So this is a GIS map showing all the location of cocoa farms that we have mapped under one of our programs. So this is at the aggregation levels, a lot of farms. But at the farm level, we give farmers this kind of information. So we print a copy for each farmer, for the farmer to know the size of the whole farm. And then for what we are seeing on this slide shows the total acreage of the farmer, and then the BMP farm that we established for the smallholder farmer to demonstrate that adoption of best practices increase productivity. And then the other side, the orange one, shows the reference farm. So that one is business as usual, just for the farmer to compare the productivity from the two farms.
And so thank you for that, Rosemary, as a first glimpse of your work there on the ground. So for African producers, what do you consider as the main bottleneck for the use of ICT solutions?
Almost all farms are based in the rural areas, and we have limited infrastructure to support deployment of ICT solutions. And also, because of high literacy rates, it's difficult for farmers to really adopt ICT solutions very fast. There's also limited use of smartphones, and so sometimes we adopt the use of IVR messages to the farmers, record it, and then deploy it so that farmers can listen to it and act. And also there's high cost of data. But we believe that with time, when the use of mobile phones and the penetration of mobile phones becomes so high, when we have almost everybody using it, then the cost of data will really reduce, and then more farmers can use ICT tools to solve production problems.
Okay, and if we look at, let's say, let's go a bit more into the perspective of the producer themselves, right? So how do you ensure that the solution that you develop for producers fit their needs? So.
As we believe that we need to involve users in development of our ICT solutions. So what we do is, once we identify a problem, based on our years of experience working with the producers or actors in the chain, we engage them to validate that this is really a problem, not that we are sitting down, we are imagining things. So once they agree that it's really a problem, we collaborate with them, we get input from them to find a solution to the problem. And so once we all agree on the ICT solution to the problem, a prototype is developed with input from the users. Once we have the prototype, a field test is conducted to assess the viability of the prototype and also to solicit feedback from the users. Once this is done, we deploy a revised prototype and monitor performance with selected users, only few of them from selected growing areas do that. And then over a period of time, maybe 3 months, we evaluate the performance by collecting feedback from the users. So once we collect all the feedback, we then incorporate into we finalize the tool by incorporating the feedback, and then we deploy it in the wider community, maybe using more actors in the chain to also try it. So that is how we've been solving our problems, or this is how we've been using our ICT tools, the processes we've been doing, just to make sure that at the end of the day, whatever it is that is developed fits the needs of the users.
So user-centric solutions, so that's a key issue there. Anything else you would like to add there?
And so all efforts must be made to include all the marginalized. We just cannot go ahead and leave farmers because they are illiterate or because they cannot afford smartphones. So efforts must be made to make sure that new solutions coming up can be deployed on any simple mobile phone. Thank you.
Thank you, Rosemary, for your explanations and also giving a glimpse of your work there in Africa. So maybe for the attendants, that there might be a lot of information already, and I would like to deep dive with a few questions to the panelists. If you as a viewer would like to pose a question, I would like to invite you to do so in the chat screen and the options that you have as attendants of this meeting, ICT for Ag. We will take a couple of questions in the minutes and in a few minutes and discuss them between the panelists. In the meanwhile, I have a question there for Felipe. Felipe, when applying corporate due diligence across supply chains, what difference can ICT solutions make to help in that process, and particularly in the last mile? Can you provide perhaps an example of the data that is critical to collect?
Yes, thank you, Joel. Yes, and I think Neil made some reference to the information that's required, right? You know, the due diligence frameworks, it's interested in generating information, you know, around the description and the quality of the products, but more importantly, the origin of these products. And this brings this geolocalization piece, you know, trying to tap into coordinates, latitude and longitude of all the plots and where the relevant commodities and products are produced. Now, when we go beyond what's required and try to think of what difference can ICT do, I like to pick up what Martina mentioned. You know, this you can go so far with the top-down metrics, and those are important tools that need to be deployed. But the ICT allows us to you know, cover that 1/5 component that you need to address from the bottom up. If you do that appropriately, we can deploy this technology, this digital technology, in an intelligent manner. You know, we basically convert information from the ground into a very valuable asset. You know, it becomes a bottom-up approach that empowers and leverages. You know, it creates a level playing field between producer and consumer markets, and a joint effort to try to solve this equation. And this was highlighted by Rosemary, you know, how tough it is to engage the smallholders. Right? Some of the challenges around the regulation is that, you know, if we don't do this bottom-up approach, we might end up you know, having the smallholders out of the picture, becoming victims of this strategy. If we do it the other way around, if we deploy these technologies, they can be important players, they can be drivers of the solutions. Now, just to conclude, I think that although, you know, the last mile is important, because this is where we can get this added value, we need to understand that the way commodities get commercialized leads to a lot of bulk cargo dynamics. So how can the information be used in such a way that the due diligence statements from companies going into the markets and effectively showcase the traceability becomes also a challenge. I think Niels highlighted how the information management, yes, let's build from the bottom up, but let's make sure we can really use ICT technologies to also create the validity of the information at the marketplace, and therefore provide value to that asset that I just referred to.
Thank you, Felipe. So you see a major role for smallholders there in order to succeed, let's say, in the objectives of due diligence, corporate due diligence, but also legislation that comes out. And if not included, this will become, let's say, much more of an additional obstacle rather than it empowers, let's say, what you're aiming for. Maybe the same question for Martina in that regard. Could you perhaps, let's say, give your view on this? You know, like when applying corporate due diligence across your supply chain, because you have several supply chains, what difference can these ICT solutions make in that process in the last mile?
Yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, there's some key benefits, right? Of course, the first one is access to data and that traceability. You know, having these technologies allow us to trace back to that last mile for those commodities, and then you get transparency across this whole supply chain. Because we're committed to 100% responsible sourcing, we could gather information through the ICT technologies on, you know, social information, so that we can prove or monitor compliance with social and environmental standards as well, and keep monitoring and measuring our continuous improvement across that. But I think another piece that we've talked a bit in here already is this inclusion of smallholders in the overall supply chains. That's going to be will be hopefully a real benefit of this, but again, they have to have access to those ICT tools, right? But we're committed to supporting the smallholders, and it's not just to support them socially, but also to get them access to those supply chains, because again, that gives them access to relevant markets for their goods. So that, you know, the farm to bar project that I discussed earlier is like a lighthouse project that gives us the opportunity to prove that we can link smallholder to, all the way through to the supply chain to the end product. And potentially we could replicate this success in other regions with other projects.
That sounds very promising, Martina. And I think, talking about smallholders, I did an introduction. It gave as well a brief overview of one of the people that have not been talking yet in the panel, which is Jose Pardo. Jose, you're, let's say, working daily on a daily basis with smallholders. Your company has clustered through a very innovative approach, let's say, a huge chunk of smallholders within the Colombian context of palm oil production. And can you provide, perhaps, we talked a bit already about some of the barriers. Can you provide like an example of what you see as the main bottlenecks for the use of ICT solutions in the last mile? And how do you think that can be addressed from your perspective?
Okay, thank you, Joel. Good morning. My name is Jose Pardo. I work with Oleflores Group, who is a group who work with a smallholder in Colombia in the palm oil sector. Well, about bottlenecks in the use of ICT, I believe that there is the main limit to use the ICT in the rural areas in Colombia is the limited connectivity, especially in the most remote rural areas. Although Colombia has made significant investment in telecommunications infrastructure in recent years, but these have been concentrated in the large urban areas, not in the rural. I think that investing in infrastructure to generate good connectivity can be very expensive and surely exceed the scope of the technological inclusion projects. But I think that at least there are two things that we can help to improve the situation, and we are working in it in our projects. First of all, the digital tools are designed to be used by rural producers, most including offline functionality. Yeah, I mean, the smallholders should be able to interact with the digital tools even without connection. This tool must offer the possibility of being updated. One of the farmer could establish a connection, either when he goes to the towns or we go to what I would call connection points, which is the other idea that I think that can minimize the connectivity problems. I think that we can locate in strategic points in the remote population some satellite connection points where the farmers can go to connect to be able to regularly update information of the digital tools. I think with these two ideas, we can minimize the connectivity problem. Locating access points in strategic places in the rural areas, and including the functionality of working offline to the ICT tools.
Thank you, Jose. That these are very two clear points that we then can take out, right? So access points on the one hand, and the other point, what you mentioned, like working, let's say, offline applications and providing that offline option for producers, specifically in remote areas. Now, Niels, you already provided an example in the Asian context. What do you consider as, let's say, the main bottleneck there?
I think a main challenge will be how to scale interaction. I think if we talk about satellite monitoring from a technical perspective, it might be kind of an external activity. But if we talk about traceability and mapping all the farms in relation to what is forests, as my example showed, not all what is green is forest, right? So we want to avoid that farmers are blamed for clearing their perennial plantations and mistake it for deforestation. I think one important thing there might be the value of local knowledge of smallholders and local people to say, look, this is a farm that I had for 30 years. Look, we have a picture here. This has been a plantation for all the time. That is one way I think that local knowledge can contribute, but it has to be integrated, and there are a big blocker is the interaction and scaling the interaction between people, in my respect, rather than the technical side.
Okay, thank you, Niels, and also for that clarification from your perspective. Meanwhile, there are a few questions that are already now coming in. Before we go to the first question of the audience, we would like to put a poll and ask the audience as well, particularly a question. So what you will see is likely a pop-up where you can actually see, let's say, our question. And what we would like to ask you is what you consider as the most critical data to collect in order to fulfill due diligence criteria. You can fill in. Meanwhile, we go to the first question, and I would like to go to the question for Niels. There's one question that comes in from Abdoulaye Dia, and he asked, our resolution of free available satellite data permit a real-time production forecast for tiny smallholder farming plots of rice, groundnuts, or cotton. I'm not sure if we understood correctly your question, but let's say, Niels, what can you give as a feedback to Abdoulaye?
Fortunately, the technical developments are going relatively very fast. So we see that the information content of the freely available satellite imagery, but also the spatial detail has improved a lot. We're now working with 10-meter resolution, which is much better, much more feasible to monitor smaller plantations, but it remains a big challenge. So when we're seeing now that, for example, Norway, the NICFI program is working with Planet on providing 3 to 5 meter resolution data, that also helps. So I think from a technical perspective, if you look at deforestation, that's good. If we look at, say, more the agronomic information for smallholders, we're working to solve quite some challenges there, especially if you have mixed crops and trees, groundnuts somewhere, that can be super tricky still. It's not so easy.
Thank you, Niels, for that specific question. And let us ask, let's provide as well, let's say, some more time for more questions. Meanwhile, I would like to ask a question to Jose, and particularly, let's say, on in terms of how do you generate value for farmers by collecting this data? So digitizing the last mile is important here. So putting into the hands of these farmers these tools, enabling them to use them by teaching them as well the skills, the digital skill set to do so, providing the infrastructure. But with the data itself, Jose, what suggestion can you give in terms of turning that data into benefits for the farmers themselves? How can they use that information also for their good and also perhaps for compliance reasons? You're mute, Jose.
Sorry. I believe that the greatest value that the digital tools provide to the producer is that of being able to make faster and better decisions at all levels in terms of productivity, sustainability, good practices, financial aspects. For this reason, I believe that in the first phases of the implementation of the ICT tools, there must be a strong training to the smallholders to guarantee the adoption of the tool and the interpretation of the data for making decisions that have a positive impact in their productive activities. I think this is the greatest value, because if you can collect data, the farmer can use the ITC tool, but if you don't analyze the data and you don't take better decisions for your production, you are not optimizing the using of the tool. I think that we have to do, especially in the first phases of the implementation, is strong training for the smallholder. We have to guarantee that the adoption of the tool is integrated, and that the smallholders can interpret the data and can take better decisions for his productive activities.
Thank you, Jose. And I think that's a critical point as well. Like data as such, they're not value if you're not able to use them in a proper way, right? So both, up in the supply chain, up, let's say downstream, but also, let's say, for the initial producer that provide that data as well. So I think it's a crucial element there to consider. Maybe for another question for Martina. Martina, can you provide us an example of how ICT solutions have increased the results and impacts in your supply chain? And maybe you can highlight a bit of the work you've already have been doing in the past years with the company.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, I mean, our supply chains are really complex, right? So there's a lot of actors involved coming all the way from the farm into the products, and there's a lot of distance between the smallholders and our production sites or Henkel. So to be able to prove compliance, we have to get that data from the smallholders, and then every actor in the supply chain has to be involved and has to utilize these technologies. Otherwise, the information isn't going to flow. And I think that's why the farm to bar is actually kind of a unique, it's an interesting project, but it's in a sense, but it's also a little bit limited, right? So it's within a specific ecosystem. We almost have this like perfect ecosystem where you have the smallholders, you have Oleo Flores as the oil producer, and we have the bar soap producer, all within this sort of area. And so then we can prove feasibility on this somewhat limited ecosystem of a project. And I think, again, like I said, this is a good way to do that, prove the feasibility, and then see if we can scale it further across what I would consider to be more complicated or even longer supply chains.
Thank you, Martina. And maybe the same question for Felipe. What do you consider, let's say, as maybe you have already provided an example on how that ICT solutions have provided, let's say, meaningful insights for, let's say, due diligence, and also perhaps for legislators as well, that they understand like what the role ICT solutions can play in that regard.
Yes, thank you, Joel. I think that's a great question, because actually I think there is a need to step up and demonstrate how the use of technology it's really a way of putting into practice this regulation. We have to understand that the regulation hasn't been approved at the EU level. It has many forces. You can have communities basically trying to water down the regulation and continue the status quo. So if we can demonstrate, and especially coming from producer countries, that there are cases and there's tools and there's energy to address this challenge setting, but create an opportunity out of it, that would be positive. Of course, there are examples. There are, you see Tony Chocolonely experience where their business model is basically built around impact, and they have their bean tracker tool that it's a successful case. But the challenge with the regulation is that we want to really mainstream this within the system, and this requires a different combination. I would say, if I go to what Jose mentioned, we do need open source technology there for producers, for smallholders to be in a position to exponentially get engaged into the dynamic. But it's not enough. As Niels mentioned, you have to have quality cross control. You have to go into those more, focused approaches so that the traceability can play out and add up. So this is where the space for alliances come in. And I would say that the opportunity for innovation through exercise like what Henkel is doing and so on becomes really attractive, especially if it comes from the producer level. That's how you can really convince legislators at the market level that this could be feasible. We have to aim for ambition, but also feasibility.
Thank you, Felipe, and I think that's also a nice way to go to the closing of the session. Before we go there, I would like to just to show the result of the poll, where we ask you, let's say, to highlight what you consider as most critical data there. I think traceability comes up here, which is interesting because actually that's also the link, between the producers and the markets as such, right? So I think that also applies very well here in the discussion. Now, maybe to round up this session, and what we have heard a bit are a few things, and we would like to go back to what we see as a key insight that we want to give back. On the one hand, in terms of how can we increase the results and impact of these solutions for the users. So users, what I mean is not only the producers, but also the companies as such. I think we heard a bit about training and about the skill set for the producers themselves in the last mile, in order them to make use of those data for their own farms, for their own business management of what they do on the ground. But on the other hand as well, we have heard about the cross analysis that we have to make between different sources of information, and what already was also mentioned, using, for example, ground data combined with satellite data, and how do you use that, particularly, for example, to a specific area, or it could be also, let's say, for a supply chain. I think that it comes back a bit on the it depends on your business model, where Felipe already highlighted a few companies that already, let's say, use, let's say, this very integrated way, and have good results, not only from a sourcing perspective, but also from a commercial or a marketing perspective. So it goes beyond just, let's say, the compliance perspective. If we go to the in terms of the barriers, we've heard a bit about the difficulties in connecting farmers, so the infrastructure that's on the ground in terms of coverage, internet coverage. So using, let's say, offline solutions for that regard, but also having, for example, much more use of satellite internet, what also is coming up and quite quickly will be mainstream. And with mainstreaming, I think that something that came up back in a few of your responses, that mainstreaming will become key if we want to make this this legislation on a wider scale, and that means more cost-effective solutions that are affordable for the last mile, but also cost-effective solutions that not only cost that are seen as a cost, but also generate value for the other supply chain partners in terms of reducing risks, in terms of more efficiency within the supply chain. So I think also that's something that will come back in the challenge of mainstreaming this, especially with such a landmark legislation, what comes up in the next few years, and will also become a key topic, I think, within the discussion on the different supply chain forum. Maybe the last part, what we also here wanted to highlight here was how to use and do the analysis and interpretation of the data collected by ICT solutions. We heard a bit about the difficulties that we have in terms of the definitions. So what is a forest? What is deforestation? How do you detect that? And also there it's important to have, let's say, a different sources of information in order to get the picture right on the ground in the last mile. Not necessarily everything what changes on the map is deforestation. There is, let's say, also, let's say, that has to do with, for example, productive practices in terms of renewal of crops. There's a lot of, let's say, what we can consider as, let's say, perhaps black spots, no, that is black spots, blind spots, sorry, in the legislation. How do we apply it inefficiently so that in the end, the data that we have don't work against you, but rather work in favor of you? And I think that maybe is also something that for legislators, something to keep in mind when forcing that. And then I would like to close here with the remark of Felipe. That alliances here are a key block here too. Alliances should go across the supply chain, meaning that you have, let's say, the different processing companies and the consumer goods companies aligned with the suppliers, but also, let's say, with the very last mile of their supply chain, and using, let's say, the insights of companies that have, let's say, very, I would say, added value in terms of the data that they can provide. I think we can come a long way so far, but that also is something that needs to be mainstreamed in the coming years. So mainstreaming alliances. I hope we will see a lot of more of examples like Henkel is doing currently in the future, also with other types of agro commodities that we're sourcing from areas which are, let's say, under this monitoring of this new legislation. So I would like to thank everyone for their participation, the panelists in particular, but also the attendants for joining us today in this session. This session will be available later on as well if you would like to review the discussions or the presentations, and also the names and any questions that are still there can be asked to our panelists at a later stage. So thank you for that, and it was a pleasure to have you in this session.